Brad from Collines Vineyard. Brad's been the vineyard manager there since what year did you start, Brad?
My first season there was 2018. So
2018.
yep, 5 harvests deep.
Yeah, we decided this year that we're going to highlight each of the vineyards that we work with, the sleight of hand, rather than focus on the wines. We feel like you guys already know enough about our wines, but we wanted to maybe give you guys some more information about all of our vineyards. And so every month in 2023, we're going to feature one of our vineyards, as well as hopefully be able to interview the vineyard manager. And Brad, we're honored to have you as our first one. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
Let's before we get started, I'm going to do a little share screen deal here, and we are going to, let's see here. We are going to look at Collines Vineyard, give you guys an idea about where it's at. So here we are looking at the United States. We've got Washington State right here. You've got the Cascade Mountain Range running up and down north-south here. And of course, you've got the Columbia Basin right here. And you can see the Walla Walla Valley is tucked in right next to the Blue Mountains, which play a prominent role in Collines and the amount of rainfall we get there. But as we zoom in, I'm going to go ahead and drop on down. Here's the Walla Walla Valley right here. And you can see that Collines sits on the eastern edge of the Walla Walla Valley and on the downward slopes of the Blue Mountains, which reside just to the east of the vineyard. And so let's go ahead and do a little cool flyby and stuff and drop right down into the vineyard. So we are fortunate enough to work with 2 blocks of Collines. And right here, we've got Block 23. It's right next to the winery, Garrison Creek's production facility and tasting room and winery right here. And we've got Block 50 up top. And we're going to talk about both of those blocks with Brad today. But Brad, why don't we can continue to look at the vineyard, but why don't we talk a little bit about, well, let's, I'm going to stop share. Let's talk about you first. You say you moved up here in 2018. Why don't you give us a little background of you and your history in vineyard management, how you got in vineyard management, where you started, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Midwest. I'm originally from Wisconsin. At some point late in high school, I knew I wanted to work in agriculture, but I didn't want to continue with the corn and soybean track there. So when I went to college at University of Wisconsin-Madison, I was a plant pathology major with the intention of using that degree to get a job in the wine industry eventually. So it was kind of a work in progress. Graduated, went to the Peace Corps in Nicaragua for a couple of years, and then moved to Napa. And first vintage I worked was 2005. And I worked for Farniente and Paul Hobbs in California. I was there for about 15 years, managing vineyards in both Napa and Sonoma counties. Everyone does a cab from Napa and a Pinot or a Chardonnay from Sonoma Coast. So I was going up and over the hill quite a bit. I lived on the Napa side of things for about 9 years, and then we lived in Sonoma County for another 6, and eventually wanted to get out of the California hustle and bustle and all the wildfires and all that. And so we kind of took a leap and moved up to Walla Walla. We had only been here twice before visiting, but really liked the area. So we just kind of just drove up without jobs. And fortunately, the vineyard I managed, Collines, was in a little bit of a ownership change. There were originally 2 partners. One bought out the other, and they were looking for a new vineyard manager. So I got hired the day after I moved here, which was fortunate. Worked out great, and just kind of got to work. Quite a bit of the vineyard needed to be replanted, so I pulled about 40 acres initially, and we're in the process of replanting. And vineyard, the bulk of it was planted between 2001 2003. So some of the blocks are starting to fail with age. We have some hard winters that can affect the longevity of a vine. So yeah, just kind of got to work.
The vineyard itself, when you came into Collines, and you said it was originally planted 01 to 03, what the property itself is how many acres?
The property itself is 300 acres.
And how many planted?
So when we are back up to full capacity, it'll be 240 planted. The other 60, there's some lower spots that aren't suitable. There's the area where the winery is and the tasting room. So a lot of the areas that are not plantable, we're sort of turning back into habitat, partnerships with Pheasants Forever and that sort of thing. So that's a really fun project. Increase biodiversity in vineyard, because too many vineyards are basically just vines and roads. So yeah, we're just trying to utilize the space, what's best for the vines, use for the vines, and everything else can kind of go back to habitat.
Yeah, I remember driving by that this spring and just seeing how beautiful it was, all the wildflowers and all the birds and
Yeah.
everything. You've got the is it Yellow Hawk runs right next to you?
It's Cottonwood Creek.
Cottonwood Creek. Okay.
Yep.
That's a drainage area right there.
Yep.
And I know that runs just to the north of the vineyard.
Correct. Yeah, it's really neat creek, because it comes down from Cottonwood Canyon from up in the Blues, and it's just basically a wildlife corridor. So we've seen moose wander down, lots of cougars, bobcat, wolf pack, like all kinds of things. Use that as kind of a super highway.
Yeah, this is the creek right here. Kind of runs from the out of the Blue Mountains, right here, and then runs right just to the north of Lake Helene. Yeah, it's really beautiful area for sure. So of the 240 acres that eventually are going to be, and by the way, is that one of the largest vineyards in the valley? I mean, is it not?
It
Is
is
it the largest?
It's the largest contiguous vineyard. So the largest, basically self-contained vineyard.
There we go. And as we're looking at the blocks right here, Brad, it doesn't really, let me see if I can get any elevation gain here. So as this is the top corner where my mouse is the highest point of the vineyard. Am I right?
That's correct. 1,360 feet.
1260, and then by the time you get down here to the gate and to the road, you're down to what?
About 1,100. So it goes, from 1,360 to 1,100.
Okay.
And so it's basically one continuous slope. Kind of the view I'm looking at right now, you see we're right on the Washington-Oregon border. In fact,
right here,
our deer fence is the border.
Yep.
And so you could roll a basketball from the top of that hill all the way down to the road, and it would just keep on going. It's one continuous slope, which is pretty crucial for winter hardiness for the vineyard.
Yeah, and we sort of discovered that the past couple of days with the temperatures that we've had. Brad was telling us earlier that he was out 2 nights ago getting the wind machines up and running. We got down to right around 0 degrees here in Walla Walla. And there wasn't really much of an inversion, but just keeping that air moving rather than just sitting on top of the vines seemed to help a little bit. Thankfully, we're in the dead of winter, and hopefully everything's as dormant as it was going to get. We did have a fairly long cold weather streak kind of leading up to it. It wasn't like it went from 60 degrees to 0. So hopefully the vines are going to be okay in that regard. So, well, let's talk about, I'm just going to stop share there. Let's chat a little bit about Syrah in those blocks. We have 2 blocks. We have block 23, which is down below.
Yep.
And I believe it's all Phelps Syrah that's up there that was planted, which is the predominant clone of Syrah in Washington State. Although, have you experimented with any new clones up there yet?
You know what? We have not. I haven't planted any new Syrah blocks since we've been there.
Okay.
And back when the vineyard was planted, I think basically Phelps was the clone. So
yeah,
that's
for sure.
Yeah, and so that's every vine of Syrah we have currently planted is Joseph Phelps.
Yeah, we have with the block 23 and block 50. Not only are they in different locations, block 50 is at a higher elevation. Block 23 is a little lower, right next to the winery. But you have 2 distinctly different training systems. Why don't you tell us about VSP and that modified minimally pruned GDC or whatever we want to call it?
Yeah, so block 23 is sort of a traditionally planted block for Eastern Washington. Most vineyards kind of did it the same way for many, many years, which is basically a trunk, two cordons, in a trellising system that keeps the shoots growing straight up. One of the issues with Syrah is it doesn't hold itself up well. It's kind of a long growing floppy canopy. And so the traditional thought was keep it contained within wires, keep it tidy, and keep it under control. And so block 23 and most of the other blocks are sort of cordon trained vertical shoot positioning system. Block 50, I believe, was originally planted as kind of an experiment. When Lake Colline was first planted, it was, I believe, intentionally planted to be a commercial vineyard for large wine companies like Hogue.
Okay.
And block 50 was an experiment to see if sort of a system they use in Australia where they don't have a lot of hand labor is just sort of a very tall canopy in a single wire up top, and the shoots fall where they fall. And the original intention was harvest it all with machine, and just all went into huge bottlings. What they found, though, through the years is block 50, because of the way it was trained, in radically different exposures from top to bottom, inside a canopy, outside of the canopy, you end up with these long, spindly clusters with very small berries that looks completely different than our other Syrah blocks in the traditional VSP. And the wines very much reflect that. And so it's just a very unique thing. We don't prune that every year. Everything else we prune every year. That one we prune every couple of years to kind of like get some of the dead wood out of there, open things up a little bit. But it's generally speaking a no-touch block until we get into harvest. Harvest there is very challenging. It's clusters everywhere, high, low, inside the canopy, outside of the canopy.
Yeah.
Crew slows down. If we can pick 6 to 8 tons an hour of Syrah elsewhere, there we're looking at 1 ton an hour.
Yeah.
So it's a snail crawl.
For sure. And the photo that I have on the screen here is basically underneath the canopy. And you can see how broad it is left to right. And you can just see how many clusters there are looking straight up in that. It's just really remarkable. A traditional VSP at 9x5 may have 20 to 24 clusters on it if you want to hit that 3.5 ton range. These plants could have 100 clusters on them, but am I right that the weights tend to come in around the same as the VSP?
Yeah, exactly.
And so even though you've got,
they're very similar,
4 times as many clusters on each plant, the weight of each cluster is so dramatically different and so much smaller, because there's just, you see how spindly those clusters are and all the gaps in between. It doesn't look like a normal Syrah cluster. So have you ever actually taken a vine, harvested every cluster, and weighed each cluster to get an average cluster weight?
We tried once. So yeah, generally speaking, the way you do crop estimates is you count your clusters, you weigh your clusters, you extrapolate over the block, and then you get your more or less tons per acre. We attempted once, and we didn't even get to the point where we felt comfortable. We counted every cluster, and it was like hide and seek. We were well over 100, and we did a couple vines, and they were radically different because there's no like permanent structures there. It changes every year, and we kind of just gave up. But generally speaking, we're usually between like the 3 to 4.5 tons per acre. It's one of our more consistent blocks yield wise. Even in lighter years where the rest of the vineyard doesn't have a lot of crop on it, it'll still be lighter in block 50, but not as extreme. It almost has a bit of a buffering capacity.
Yeah. Well, let's talk to Keith here real quick about the differences, because Keith gets to work with the grapes every year in the winery. Let's talk about harvest dates first. Do we see a similarity, and are we picking 23 before 50, 50 before 23, same time?
We used to always pick 23 first. But I think really since Brad has come along, we're finding that the ripening curves are actually much more similar these days than they used to be. And But it also, we are finding a little bit that the block 50 tends to come across as ripe at lower sugar levels. So the
Yeah.
physiological nature of that block. Yeah, I don't know. So pick dates have kind of flip flopped or are pretty close. Again, used to be always 23 first, then 50. This last year, 2022, we picked block 50, a week
Yeah.
before 23. But at roughly the same sugar levels, So it's, I don't know, that's something that would go into more looking at the overall vineyard farming philosophy, I think, as to why that is. But when the fruit comes in the door, we're going lots of whole cluster on block 50. In fact, 100% always. We just don't want to put those little tiny clusters through the destemmer. They don't destem very well anyway, so we might as well just embrace it. Whereas 23, we're destemming quite a bit more. Much smaller berries in block 50, as we touched on, which just leads to a much more tannic, much more intense expression. And I think that block 50, if anything, is almost like a distilled down, intensified version of what Lake Collines is. And so it's all of that kind of floral purple flowers and that core of minerals, like that dark earthy minerality that you get from Lake Collines is intensified in block 50 for me, whereas block 23 carries those same traits, but in a gentler, little bit more approachable way. And
you get more of those plum black fruit notes off of.
Absolutely. And so for me, 23 reflects Washington State wine or Washington State Syrah a little bit more broadly, whereas block 50 is, screams Lake Collines every vintage. But sometimes, it can be a little too intense. Some vintages, the block 50 fruit is just so overpowering. And sometimes that works out well for us because we can hold on to those for extended aging and bottle them by themselves as a special, bottling. We've done that a couple times. And sometimes, though, it's just such a intense wine, it just doesn't want to come around. And it's a great blending component for the Levitation, but maybe in smaller amounts. But for sure, one of the most interesting blocks we work with is block 50. And then for me, block 23 is just a lot more predictable and reliable as a major component in the Levitation.
Brad, what is the soil profile up there? I know that, when we talk about Washington State, you always hear windblown loess, and you hear basalt. Like those are the two things you always hear about Washington State. So what soil series is up there, and what differences do you see at the top of the vineyard versus the bottom of the vineyard?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The bulk of our soil series is called Walla Walla Silt Loam. We're above elevation of where the highest waters got during the Missoula floods, so we don't have any of the Missoula flood sediment. It's all windblown loess that just kind of came in over the years, backed up against the mountains and the hillside, and created a deeper profile. The difference between the bottom of the vineyard and the top of the vineyard, usually when you think of hillsides, especially this is the way we think about things in Napa Sonoma, you have so much more erosion up there that usually those are pretty thin, lean soils, and down below is where you get your deep soils. It's flip-flopped in Lake Collines, and our higher elevations have much deeper soils. We dug 12 feet down until we started to see the ancient gravels below the silt loam. And we found roots going all the way down 12, 14 feet and 12, 14 feet out. So there's nothing inhibiting root growth, which is great. That's why we don't have to irrigate as much as it's a lot of other places. That coupled with the 22 inches of rain we get a year, which could be, 4 times what other growing regions in Eastern Washington get. So we don't have to irrigate very much. But yeah, it's really interesting. Down below, we're seeing little leaner soils, little less deep, maybe a bit more clay in it than compared to up top.
Do you think that clay is coming from the alluvial fan?
We're probably not. If you got closer down, we've dug soil pits in the lower elevations, kind of by where our office and shop are, and those are very rocky soils, similar to what you see at the rocks. So that'd
How
be more
deep?
of that.
How deep before you get to those rocks? Is it like
They're right there.
they're right there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I say clay, it's minute amounts. It's certainly not a clay soil. It just seems to hold water a bit differently. One thing I really appreciate about growing in the soils we have is water moves horizontally and vertically in those soils. It doesn't just, like Red Mountain, you irrigate, it just drains immediately away. Lake Collines, it sort of balloons out and stays. And so the vines have access to that water. So we tend to ride through heat events quite well, just because of the buffering capacity of the soil's ability to hold water.
That's awesome. Not to mention you're also a little bit cooler because of your elevation in the summertime.
Yeah.
So
We tend to be a little bit cooler in the day and a little bit warmer at night because heat rises. So we actually have a huge amount of growing degree days. It's just a different distribution. Doesn't mean we're hotter. It means, like I said, more tempered during the day and warmer at night.
Right. And that definitely plays a role in why winter events are a little less damaging, I think, at Lake Collines than when you get down to, say, where our winery is located near Pepper Bridge. When you're at 850 elevation, we get a winter event. It's really, really cold down there and tend to wreak havoc in those areas versus where you are. You seem to be in that sort of golden belt, all along the blues right there. Mill Creek, a lot of the vineyards up in Mill Creek area. Our vineyard up the North Fork in Ziggy, the Ziggy Stardust block up at elevation. That's higher elevation as well, and so seems to be the magic zone. I feel like that's where a lot of the new plantings, as the valley grows and eventually more vineyards are put in. I feel like the foothills are going to play a prominent part of that growth.
I think so.
Do you guys have any plans? I mean, are your 300 acres? Is there more land to plant, or that's it?
Yeah, 300 acres is the actual property.
Okay.
So right now we're at about 212 acres. We'll get back up to 240 eventually, but it's going to be a continuous process of removing blocks, redeveloping. We're increasing clonal diversity, starting to use root stocks. So it's big changes at the vineyard. The 40 acres I removed initially, we're starting to replant. One of the first things I recognize in this valley is there's just a huge shortage of white grapes, and wineries have a lot of interest in making white wines, but there just weren't grapes to buy. So I put in some Sauvignon Blanc and 5 Rhone varieties: Marsanne, Roussanne, Grenache Blanc, Viognier, and Picpoul in a different block. So I'm really excited about those. And then I also realized Cabernet Franc grows absolutely beautiful at Lake Collines. Perfect expression of that variety. So I increased our acreage of Cabernet Franc and also put in 6 acres of kind of a interesting block of Grenache, 2 different Antave clones going in on rootstock. I'm going to train it in kind of the traditional kind of bush vine form, head trained, spur pruned, kind of like little trees, no trellis whatsoever. Very, very excited about that block. Kind of my
So are we, Brad.
Yeah.
Yes, we're excited about a lot of the same things here.
Yeah. So just, I think, 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, when they planted the vineyard, it was still a relatively young industry in Eastern Washington then. And, Cab was king, Merlot, Syrah, they planted a lot of those 3. And, little bits and pieces of Cab Franc here, or, Petit Verdot there. And I think, you get to look at the trial and error over the decades and realize what the vineyard does very well. And in my opinion, it's whatever variety is grown there really brings in the aromatic component, which I think is special for aromatic grapes like Cabernet Franc. So
for sure.
Excited about that.
What is your farming philosophy? You always hear biodynamic and organic, and and here in Washington we talk about salmon safe, Washington and Oregon. What's your philosophy on farming, and what do you practice out at Lakeling?
Yeah, I basically farmed the same way I did down in Napa Sonoma. Napa and Sonoma were way ahead on reduced or no herbicide use. And so, we got really good at doing that all mechanically with tractors and, setting up blocks to be able to do that more efficiently. And so one of the first things I did was eliminate the use of herbicides at Lake Lean. Also, I had the fortune down in California that my family lived in the middle of a vineyard. We were in employee housing, and I controlled the spray program. So, I have little kids, and I certainly did not want to spray anything that could be potentially harmful long-term or short-term for my family. So my criteria was pretty strict on what I would use for powdery mildew control. So yeah, we're live certified, we're salmon safe, but we go far beyond that. By quite a bit. So it's, we have a workforce of 24, 25 people with families, and we don't want them bringing chemicals home to their families. And
right.
So yeah, it's a very thoughtful and intentional program to be, light on adverse risks to humans or wildlife. So take that very, very seriously.
Yeah. Can you
That's
talk
awesome.
a little bit, Brad, about your cover cropping? I think that you have the most in-depth cover cropping in the state of Washington. No, I mean, seriously, I think it's something that
Yeah.
you focus on much more than most people do in building up your soils. And you
Mhm.
talk about water retention and all of these things, and also the biodiversity that adds. So can you just talk a little bit about that as well? Because I find that to be one of the most fascinating things about how you're farming up there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe very strongly in cover crops. And by cover crops, it's something you intentionally plant, like Keith said, to enrich the soil, or there's a multitude of different reasons. If you have a vigorous site, you can put in a vigorous cover crop to kind of strip some of the nitrogen from the soil. If you have a weak site, you can build up your nitrogen using legumes, peas and beans and that sort of thing that pull atmospheric nitrogen, get into the soil in a usable form for the plants. And if you have nematodes, you can use things in the mustard family to sort of knock their populations back. So I kind of took what I had learned in California, brought it up here, but I had to change the plants, obviously, because it's a completely different climate. So when we pull a block, generally speaking, vineyards in the Eastern Washington don't have a whole lot of organic matter, especially if they've been converted from former wheat ground or something along those lines. So organic matter is what helps increase fertility a little bit, but also moisture retention and biodiversity of beneficial funguses and bacteria and living organisms in the soil. And so if I have the luxury of a couple of years before I'm going to plant, I'll do several cycles of cover crop where we grow up our cover crop. It grows beautiful here, mostly because of the amount of rainfall we get. I don't think everywhere in Eastern Washington could do cover crop, but we can, so we do. So grow it up. It usually gets filled with all kinds of nesting red-winged blackbirds and pheasant and quail, and it just kind of becomes habitat. Bees come over. And when all the nestlings have left and we don't want to do genocide on little fledgling birds, we instead of mowing and disking the soil, anytime you open up the soil, you're introducing oxygen to it and you're breaking down more organic matter. So instead of disking it in, which is traditional practice, we let it get a little brittle, and we have a very heavy roller, and we just roll it down so it lays down on the ground and produces like a thick mulch that slowly breaks down over time. So we'll do several cycles of that before we put vines in. Once the vines are in and established, then we'll put in a more permanent cover crop that we can control with mowing. And that has the benefit of giving you a solid surface to drive tractors on. You don't sink in and get stuck. So yeah, usually it's about soil building early on, and then having that permanent cover crop in for farmability.
And you're essentially farming in it really is. We live in wheat country. We like to think we live in wine country, but the reality is, if you look at our acreage, we live in wheat country.
Yeah.
And when that vineyard was planted 20 years ago, for 100 years that place has been farmed to wheat.
Mm-hmm.
And so just imagine how depleted those soils were. And I certainly don't know what the pre-planting practices were of the vineyard back in 1999, 2000. We certainly appreciate what you're doing with Lake Collines. We definitely notice a difference in the wines. They're very, very important part of our program. Not just Levitation, but as Keith mentioned, every once in a while we'll make a single vineyard bottling, just to kind of highlight how special that vineyard site is. And probably one of our most age-worthy Syrahs I think we have too is that Force of Nature. I think that's a wine that'll be a 20-25 year Syrah. Probably reminds me maybe next to the Spiders, or along with the Spiders, it is reminiscent of Northern Rhone, especially in its tannin profile and also its acid profile, because they do tend to still be quite bright and very fresh. Normally with Washington State Syrah, I'm not going to generalize to say Washington State Syrah, but certainly a lot of Syrah in Washington, you're dealing with these really high pHs and very soft textured wines and Syrahs. But Lake Collines tends to still hold on to that freshness, even if we are getting close to those 3.9, 4.0 pHs, which we have in certain vintages up there. But those wines still retain a freshness and a brightness. And again, that tannin structure really seems to be one of the defining characteristics of the wines that we get from that vineyard up there. So we love working with it, and we look forward to working with more fruit with you guys in the future. So
absolutely
awesome. Well, Brad, thank you so much for joining us for our inaugural launch of our vineyard program. Daniel will make this video even better when he adds a bunch of photos and stuff. And I'll have you send those to us so we can add them to the video. And this will be up on Vimeo as well. So I'll make sure to get you the link for that, and you can share it with whoever you want to share it with. Yeah, we're looking forward to a great growing season in 2023, and Merry Christmas to you, Brad, and your family too.
Yeah, and if I could suggest one thing to your listening crowd, check out our website. We have an exhaustive amount of information there on climate and soils. And
I did pull a lot of that stuff the other day when I was pinging you about info, and I'm like, I'll see what they have. And I'm like, wow, you guys, it's an incredible resource, really great maps. I love the soil maps with the photos of Kevin Pogue down in that pit. And you can see the root structure all the way down there as well. So really, really, really amazing. So next time, folks, you guys see Lake Collines on a bottle, and trust me, he sells. How many clients do you have, Brad? How many wineries?
We're around 60.
60. You should find, it should be easy enough to find a Lake Collines bottling out there. Pepperbridge Amavi uses Lake Collines as one of their main sources, especially for their Syrah. I know they do a Lake Collines designated Syrah. Gramercy Cellars does a great job with all the fruit that they buy up there. They're buying other things besides Syrah, aren't they? They're getting Cab up there?
Yep, they've branched off into Merlot. The big pool goes to them as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
so there's some great examples of wines coming from Lake Collines outside of Sleight of Hand. So we want you to check those out as well. So, all right, everybody. Thanks again. And Brad, we'll see you guys next season.
Okay, sounds good. You guys have a good Christmas.
Right. You bet. Take care.